one thing that we have to do here is when the enemy touches the player, then the player should be destroyed. Okay, the player should die and it should be game over. Okay, so what we're going to do is let's open mono and we're going to the jumping enemy. Here we simply check if we collided with anything. Okay, we check the moving down logic, then we apply the jumping force, but we should also check if we have collided with the player. So we're going to type here if collision dot transform dot, and now we need to check if it's a player. We need to check with that. We can check that with several different ways. We can check for the name of what we're colliding with, but that's not very safe because we might want to rename the player. We might check for the tag. That's something we have in Unity, but well, there are better ways. Or we could check if there is a component there, if a component exists. So we want to check if that object we collided with contains the player component, because if it does, it can only be the player we collided with. So now we type get component of type player, we open and close parentheses, and we check if that is different than null. Okay, so that means it exists. If there was no player component, this would return null. If there is, it would be the player component. That's different than null. So if this happens, we're going to call a method in the player that is going to kill it. So we're going to copy this line, paste it here, and we're going to type dot kill, and we open and close parentheses. Okay, it's going to be red now because there is no kill method, but we're going to save this, go to the player, and we're going to make a kill method. So here we type public void kill, like this, and for now we're going to simply destroy the player. So I'm going to type destroy and type game object as a parameter. So the object of the player is going to be vanished from this game. Okay, so we wait a little bit more. Now we press play. So we have our player here, the enemy is going to be bouncing, and if it touches us, the player completely vanished from the game. Okay, that's going to be enough for now. Now we have a challenge, and we have to avoid that jumping enemy. now have to make something that is going to control the rules of the game and also update the interface. So we're going to make a game controller. I'm going to right click here, choose create empty, and this is going to be a game controller. Okay, I'm going to move this to this position in the interface, and we're also going to make sure that the position of it is going to be 0, 0, 0. So the game controller is going to be here. Okay, it's an empty object. And now we're going to select everything else that we have except the canvas and the event system and drag inside the game controller because they all belong to the game. Okay, just to keep things organized. Now we're going to save this. And now we need to make a script for this game controller, and we need to name this game mode. Okay, it could be something like avoider or jumper. It could be different ways. So let's right click here, choose create and C# script, and let's name this avoider game controller and hit enter. Okay, so after that we select the game controller that we made here, and we're going to apply this script here, avoider game controller. Alright, so to begin we need to set the time for the game, the duration of the game. So I'm going to type here public float and then duration. Let's set 15F as default. And now that we have the duration, we also need to have a timer. So I'm going to type private float timer. Okay, and in the start method I'm going to set timer to be the same thing as duration. Okay, this is going to be our internal clock for how long the game is going to be running. In the update method, we're going to type timer minus equals time.delta time. Okay, this delta time property here is going to return how many seconds have passed since the last frame. Since we are in the update method and the update method is called once per frame, this essentially is going to work as a countdown timer. Okay, if 1 second passes, then timer is going to be 1 unit lesser than what it was before. And we need to check if timer is lesser or equal than 0f. That means that the player won the game. Okay, so let's do things one by one. First of all, in the update method, we want to set the text that we have. Okay, so we need to have a reference to that text. So let's make a few adjustments here. We're going to type using unityengine.ui in the beginning of the code. This is going to add the user interface namespace for us, so we're able to deal with text, with images, with sliders, with layout adjusters, several different things. Okay, and here we're going to type public text info text, right? And you notice that we have kind of two categories of variables here, and if we don't worry about organizing this soon, it might turn messy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an attribute here. We're going to add 2 brackets, then header, we open and close parentheses, and between parentheses I'm going to type gameplay. This is not going to change how the code works at all, but it's going to be cleaner in Unity. And here I'm going to type header, and UI between double quotes. Okay, so it's going to look like this, and I'm going to save this. Now, if you go to Unity and you look at the game controller, at the variables that are going to appear, we have a label called gameplay, then the duration, and a label called UI, and then the info text. This makes a huge difference in the end game here. Okay, if you're working on a big project, it's going to make much easier to find things, and it's actually going to help you on developing a cleaner code. Now we need to make a reference for the info text because right now it says none. So I'm going to open the canvas, bring the text from here and drop it here. Okay, now we can access that info text. And now we should move forward with improving the logic here. In the update method, I'm going to type here, if timer is greater than 0f, okay, let's do it like this, else we're going to do something else. So if timer is greater than 0, then we're going to type info text.text equals 2. Then we need to make a string. There's going to be time, colon, and space. We finish the string, plus timer. Okay, so let's see how this is going to look. We're going to save that, move to Unity, wait for the compilation to be complete, and we're going to press play. Okay, so here we are, and you see the timer is very, very difficult to read because we have that huge decimal part here. So what we can do is instead of simply typing timer, we can type mathf.floor. Okay, or we could type ceil, but let's use floor for this. Okay, it's going to convert that number and it's going to remove the decimal part. Okay, it's going to be much easier to read. If we save this and go to Unity now and wait for that to be finished, we're going to press play, and we're going to see that the timer is going to decrease like that. It's going to be much easier for us to read. You could see that it started at 14, okay, because the time starts at 15, but at the first frame it's going to be smaller than 15, and since we use floor, we won't be able to see 15. So that's the moment where you have to decide between using floor and seal, okay, but well, I think this is going to work just fine for us. So what if timer has reached 0? That means the player won the game, okay, if the player didn't die. So here we need to check if the player died. So we need a reference to the player. We're going to type public player, okay, and here in the else we're going to type if player is different than null, it means that the player is alive, okay, so we're going to type info_text.text equals to you win, okay. So we're going to save this. Let's go to Unity, wait for the compilation to be finished, and after that is done, we're going to drag the player from here to here, okay, so it's properly assigned. Alright, and now that we have done this, we also have to check if the player died, okay, so we're going to check if player equals, if player equals to null, that means that the player died. So let's type here, check if the player is alive or is dead. So if the player equals to null, that means the game should be over and the player lost the game. So we can improve this a little bit. We can type here private bool game over, that is going to start as false, and private bool win. Okay, so if player equals to null, we're going to type game over equals to true and win equals to false. Okay, game over because the game finished, and win is going to be false because the player died. And here we're going to check else, so if timer is lesser than 0, so we check if player is different than null, that means game over equals to true and win equals to true as well. Okay, so here we're going to check if the game is finished. Okay, and now for the third block we're going to type send the game over message. So we're going to type if game over equals to true, then we're going to check if win equals to true, or we can just type if win, both ways work. We're going to type info_text.text equals to you win. Else, so if the player died, we're going to type info_text.text equals to you lose. Okay, so we just tidy things up a little bit. We have a game over variable, a win variable, and if the player is dead, game over is going to be set to true and win false. If the time has finished and the player is still alive, then we do this. Okay, so we're going to save this. Let's go to Unity. We wait for the compilation to be finished, and after that's done, we're going to press the play button. Okay, so the player is here, and I just touched the enemy and I died. Okay, so we see the you lose message. Let's try to avoid that. So it's going to look fine for now. If we survive for 15 seconds, we should be able to see the you win message. There's going to be one more adjustment that we have to do. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. After that, times 0, and you win. However, the sphere can still hit the player and say that we lost the game. That's a bit unfair. Okay, so what we're going to do here is, if we win the game, we need to set the player to be invincible. Okay, so here where we set win equals to true, we're going to type player dot then we can type set invincibility. Okay, or we can type this player dot invincible equals to true. And now in the player, we're going to do two things. We're going to make a private variable that is going to be private bool invincible. It starts as false, and we're going to make a property so we can set that invincible variable, or we could also make things simple and make a public variable, but this is going to be more tidy. Okay, it's going to be tidier. So public bool invincible, and here we're going to type set, and we're going to type invincible equals to value. So if we save this and we type here player.invincible equals to true, true is going to be passed as a parameter here in set with the name value, and it's going to be set in invincible. And now in the player where we have kill, we're going to type if invincible, Then we're going to return. We're going to stop the execution of this method here in this return call. Even though it's a void method, it still works. Okay, we stop the execution, it's going to be okay. Now we're going to save that, go to Unity, wait for the compilation to be finished, and after that's done, we can press play. Okay, we're going to avoid that enemy, it's going to be jumping around us. So let's wait for the game to be finished, and we're going to see if the player is really invincible. Okay, so we beat the game. 2, 1, 0, and you win, and if it touches the player, nothing special happens because we're invincible now. Okay, so that's great, we have a fully working game. Now that we have a fully working game, we need to make a very important decision right now. So we have our player here standing on the floor, and we have the jumping enemy. And we do all of this in a scene called game, which we thought it would be a good idea to rename later. But the problem is we're going to make 6 different games, or even more if you want. Okay, this is going to be one of the challenges that you have to take once you finish this course. The problem is there are lots of things that are common between the games. We have the player, we have the floor, we're going to have some art assets that are going to be here. So it's going to be a bit more difficult and a bit more not organized to tune things, to change the art, to change the player. We would have to check all of the scenes that we make, all of the games that we make, and that might not be good, okay, for a game that should be simple in its essence and should be very quick to play. So what we want to do is to transform this controller that we make, the Avoider game controller, is something that's more generic. So instead of being responsible only for the Avoider game, we want it to be responsible for all the games that we have. Okay, so what we have right now is we have a gameplay section that has a reference for the player and the duration. We have a part for the UI that talks about the info text. We have timer, game over, win, and all of the things that we see here, they are going to be used in every game that you make. Okay, the game over logic is going to be the same, the timer logic is going to be the same. Just a few things are going to change between different games. Okay, controls, for example, they change a little bit between games, but in general, this is everything that we're going to use in every game that we make. So what I recommend doing right now is you're going to rename the Avoider game controller to simply game controller. Okay, let me remove that extra character, and we're going to enter that renamed file that we made right now, and we're going to rename the class. Okay, so let me edit here, game controller. I'm going to double click, so it's going to be open in mono, and I'm going to remove the Avoider part. Okay, just game controller. Once we do this, we're going to the game controller, and I'm going to update the script here. Okay, and everything else is going to be back. We have the player, the duration, the info text. And one of the most important steps to make this very reusable is by changing how the jumping enemy is going to be added to the scene. Right now it is just standing in the middle. Okay, the game starts with that already here. But we want the game controller to be responsible for spawning this jumping enemy. Why do we want to do this? We're going to make multiple levels, okay? We're going to make, for example, 10 different levels, and each of these levels are going to have different difficulty settings. One of the difficulty settings for this jumping game, okay, to avoid this jumping enemy, is the amount of enemies that we're going to have. So if you were going to make a level 10, for example, you would want to have 3 jumping enemies. You would need an extra scene just for that. Okay, so 3 jumping enemies, another scene. 4 jumping enemies, another scene. That would be really messy, and we can do this in a smarter way. So what we should do is transform this jumping enemy into a prefab. And a prefab works just like any game object. It is a game object. Okay, but the difference is that it's going to be saved in our project so we can reuse it later. This is very important when we are making objects that are reused and duplicated, like coins, like health kits, for example. This is very common when you're making a game. So to transform this jumping enemy into a prefab, we're going to the project folder, you right click, then create, and then folder, and we're going to name this prefabs. And inside that prefabs folder, we need to make the prefab for the jumping enemy. there are two ways to make that prefab. You can come here in this folder, right click, create, and then you choose prefab and name this whatever you want, so jumping enemy for example, and you're going to see that you have a white cube. That means nothing has been assigned here yet. So you can now select a jumping enemy from the hierarchy, drag and drop here. You notice that it turned blue for a brief second, and it's the actual icon, it's a blue cube, and you can now see a preview of the jumping enemy. And there's also another way to make a prefab. You can just click on it, drag and drop here, and Unity is going to understand that you're making a prefab so you can reuse it later. Okay, so we have this jumping enemy right here. And well, it still works as a prefab, okay? The game is going to be working pretty much the same. The jumping enemy is going to fall, you have to avoid it like this, and it's going to behave the exact same way. So what we need to understand now is how to dynamically add this jumping enemy here in this game. So let's learn how to do this. Our goal right now is to simply delete this jumping enemy from the hierarchy, so we can do that right now. We just right click and choose delete, and we want the game to add the jumping enemy itself, okay, by itself. So what we have to do here is we're going to open the game controller script, and remember we have two sections, gameplay and UI. Let's add a new one. So we're going to add a header like this, a bracket header, then between parentheses we're going to add the string game colon, and we can name this jumpers, for example, or whatever name you want to give. And what we want to make here is a public game object, and this is going to be the jumping enemy prefab. Okay, so this is a game object. It's a bit different than how floats and ints work. Okay, it's going to work more or less like how we reference the player and the info text. If you save this and go to Unity, you're going to wait for the code to compile, and once you look, you now have the jumpers section, and we have that jumping enemy prefab. So we can drag the prefab in here. We need to pass a reference. So I'm going to drag the jumping enemy from here, and I'm going to drop it here. Okay, now we have a reference to the jumping enemy. And now that we have this, we need to find a way to instantiate that, so we can use the start method for this. What we're going to do is we're going to type game object jumping enemy object equals to, and now we're going to call a very simple method called instantiate. And between parentheses we pass the original game object, which is the reference that we want to use. In our case, it's going to be the jumping enemy prefab. Okay, this is enough for adding the jumping enemy into the scene. So now we can save this, we can wait for the code to be finished, and now we're going to press play. And as the game runs, you're going to see that the enemy appeared in here just like it should appear. Okay, and a few details. You're going to notice that the name of the jumping enemy is jumping enemy clone, but that's not a problem. Okay, it's just to say that it has been instantiated. And another detail is that jumping enemy has been instantiated outside of the game controller and the hierarchy. While this works, okay, you can do the entire game with this working like that. It's not very good to make it stay here, okay? So since it belongs to the game, we should add it to the game controller in the hierarchy. It should dynamically appear like this, okay? So one way to do this is you can simply come here and type jumping enemy object dot transform dot set parent, and between parentheses we're going to pass transform, and this transform here is going to reference the game controller. Okay, so this means that the jumping enemy is going to have the game controller as its parent, so it's going to be under the game controller in the hierarchy. We can save this, go to Unity, and we can test this one more time. Now we're going to press play, and now we can see that the jumping enemy has appeared here, and that was a very close call. Okay, now this time I lost. Okay, so now that we have the jumping enemy here, we should improve the code a little bit, so we're going to be able to switch between different games. We're going to make a new game really soon that's going to require a new enemy, and there must be a good way for us to switch if we want to instantiate the jumping enemy, for example, or if we want to instantiate the rolling enemy. So let's work on this. want this game scene to be responsible for telling what game are we playing, if it's the jumping game or the rolling game, for example. So to do this, there is a very nice and tidy way to perform this logic. What we want to do is, we want to go to the game controller, and before the first method declaration, we're going to type this public enum, and then we're going to type this game mode. We can open and close curly braces, and here we're going to type two names. So we're going to type jumpers, a comma, and we're going to type rollers. So what is happening here? When we make an enum, we're going to make a kind of a structure that can have different values. Okay, so in this case, there are going to be only two possible values, jumpers and rollers. Or we could add other ones here, like shooters, for example. But the thing is, internally, these names are not strings. They are integer numbers. They are simply numbers. So this one is 0, this one is 1, and this one is 2. So why do you use enums? We want to make this readable. Okay, we want to make sure that this is going to be very easy for us to understand what game we are playing. And now that we define this enum here, we can come here in the gameplay and we can type public, and then we're going to type game mode with uppercase G, and now we can repeat game mode with a lowercase g. If we save this and we go to Unity, we wait for a little bit, and once you look here, you're going to have this game mode viewed, and notice that we made a very convenient and very easily readable drop down menu here. Okay, so we have jumpers, but if we click, we can choose rollers or shooters. And we can do this while we are editing the game in Unity, so you can have another teammate to work in this game and simply switch what game mode they want to play here to test it out. Okay, this is very good for testing your games, and this is exactly what we want. Now, what we want to do here is, in the start method, we only want to add the jumping enemy object if we are in the jumpers game mode. Okay, so there are several ways to do this. One of them is to simply type if game mode, and now we are using the variable, okay, with a lowercase g. If game mode equals two equal signs, as we're making a comparison, to game mode dot jumpers. Okay, this is the comparison that we want to make. We want to see if game mode contains the same value as game mode jumpers, which is, in this case, internally 0. Now we're going to put these lines between the curly braces right after this if block, and we can save this, and we can confirm if the jumping enemies is still appearing. Okay, so let's try that out. Press play, and we have the jumping enemy right there. Okay, now if we stop the scene and we change the game mode to rollers and we press play without having to wait for another compilation, no enemies appear here. Okay, so the player can move freely in this game, and well, nothing special is going to happen. But there's another way that we can do this. Okay, so it's going to be fine if we use if, and then we use an else if, and then game mode equals to game mode dot rollers, and keep writing the code, but we can use a switch block as well. That is going to be easier for us to read, and well, it's always good to know different techniques to do the same thing. Okay, and this is very common when we are comparing the values inside an enum. We can make a switch block, so we can type switch, so in between parentheses we're going to put game mode. Okay, simply like that. It's almost like we are calling a function. And between curly braces, we're going to type all the possible cases, okay, all the possible outcomes that can be inside game mode, all the possible values. So I'm going to type here case, okay, and now I'm going to type game mode dot jumpers and a colon. And here I'm going to type all of the things that are going to happen if we are in the jumpers game mode. In our case, we can just select these two lines, we can cut them and paste here. This is what's going to happen if we are in the jumpers mode. And after we're done with this, we can type break and a semicolon. So this is just like we typed. Okay, it's if game mode equals to game mode jumpers. Now we can type case game mode dot rollers, a colon, and we just add break because we are yet to do something here. Okay, and well, this is just the template that we're going to use. We can now delete these things. We can save this. Let's go to Unity. Wait for the compilation to be finished. And now that this is done, I'm going to press the play button. Okay, and as you can see, as we are in rollers mode, nothing appeared, but if we switch back to jumpers, then the jumping enemy should be here. Okay, so there it is. Alright, and one thing that we want to do here that is going to be interesting while we are developing the game is, if you decide to make all of the game modes and by accident you have another game mode active by accident, you might be feeling something is wrong. Okay, so imagine we are here and we put in rollers, but we wanted to test the jumpers, and maybe, and that is very common what I'm about to say, and maybe we still think it's in jumping mode, we're going to press play, then the jumping enemy is not going to appear. We're going to spend minutes and maybe spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's going to happen, and then realize that we were just in the wrong option. So what we might want to do is give a tip, okay, give a hint to ourselves that a mode is yet not implemented. So in this case we have case game mode.rollers, a colon, and then here we can put a message, debug.log, and then between parentheses we can type this case or this game mode wasn't implemented. Okay, because it's not doing anything here. It's not spawning any enemies. Okay, they're just not appearing. Okay, and also instead of typing log, we can type log warning. Okay, so it's going to appear differently in Unity. Now, if we save this and go to Unity, we press the play button. And if the game executes, we're going to see a warning. It says this game mode wasn't implemented. Okay, so this is good. This is going to help us a lot, and even help other people that are going to play our game. And also, we just have this for game mode rollers. We need to add shooters as well here, as this is an option. So we could type case game mode dot shooters and a column. This works. Okay, we can bundle different lines, different case lines together to result in the same outcome. But another way to type this, okay, another way of saying, hey, jumpers work like this, but all of the other ones are simply going to raise a warning, is to replace this with the keyword default. Okay, this is like the else. Okay, in case nothing else was defined here, all of the other outcomes are going to come to this. This game mode wasn't implemented. Okay, so we can save this, and if we move to the shooters game mode, then we should see pretty much the same thing. Okay, we press play, and we have this game mode wasn't implemented. So now that we have this, now that we have all of the groundwork necessary for adding new game modes, we can work on the roller enemies. We are now going to design the rolling enemy just like the jumping enemy. So just to remind how this works, if we drag the jumping enemy into the hierarchy, we can check how it is structured. So we can see that it contains a transform component, the jumping enemy script, so we're going to make one for this new enemy. We have the rigid body, we have a sphere collider, and also in the hierarchy we have a model game object, and then just inside that game object we have the sphere. So what we want to do here is, we're going to right click, choose create empty, and this game object is going to be renamed as rolling enemy. Let me move this a little bit more to somewhere we can actually see it. So I'm going to put it on 0, 8, 0 and move it a bit to the right. Okay, so it's going to be better to work with it. Now we right click on rolling enemy, choose create empty, and rename this as model. And now here we're going to right click, choose 3D object and then sphere. But we want this sphere to be a bit bigger than the enemy that we had before, the jumping enemy. So I'm going to scale that to 1.5 on X, Y, and Z. Okay, so it's going to be roughly 50% bigger than the other enemy. Now we want to remove the sphere collider from this because we want the collision logic to run in the rolling enemy game object instead of the sphere. So I'm going to click on this cog and choose remove component, and we also want to add a color to it. So you go to the materials folder, right click, create material. I'm going to rename this as rolling enemy, and now we're going to choose its color. So let's choose this tone of blue here. Now I'm going to drag it here and drop it there. Okay, so we have this, and one thing that might be interesting to this game is to add just two very simple eyes to this rolling enemy so we can actually see it rolling around. So in Model, I'm going to right click, 3D object, and then sphere. So let's bring it forward a little bit, so let's change Z to -0.5. We want to remove the sphere collider, this is not going to be needed, and the scale, let's change that to 0.3 on all axes. Okay, so let's change Z to something a bit closer, like -0.7. X is going to be -0.3. Y 0.2, and now it looks like an eye. So let's make it closer to the enemy. Okay, so yeah, -0.58 is going to be good. We're going to rename this sphere as eye. Now we right click on it and choose duplicate just to bring the eye to the other side. Okay, so I'm going to select it. I'm going to change the value on X by simply removing the negative sign. Okay, so it's going to look like this, something very simple. Okay. Now, the second step is we want to make the rolling enemy script. So we're going to the scripts folder, we right click, choose create, C# script, and this is going to be rolling enemy. And you notice now we have two enemy scripts. We have the jumping enemy and we have the rolling enemy. So to keep things tidy, we might want to add a folder here. Right click, create folder, and this is going to simply be named enemies. Now we choose the jumping enemy and the rolling enemy, so we click on one, hold Command or Control, and click the other one, and drag them both to the enemies folder. Okay, so nothing special is going to change, but it's going to work better. Okay, so we have this jumping enemy here, and now we have to add a rigid body. So in order to mimic almost the same things that we did in here, we can just click on this cog and choose Copy Component, and in the rolling enemy, let's, by the way, before we do anything else, let's attach the rolling enemy script here. So you select the rolling enemy, drag the script and drop here. And now that we copied the rigid body, we can click on the cog and choose paste component as new. Okay, we're going to have almost all of the, actually we're going to have all of the fields duplicated from this one. Okay, but in our case we want the rolling enemy to rotate in one of its axes. Okay, we want it to rotate like this, okay, around the z-axis. There are two ways to do this. One way is to use physics, so when it moves it's going to roll around. Another way is to do things by script. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to check what axis we're going to use. So if you go to rotation and rotate Z, we're going to have more or less the effect that we want. Okay, we want the enemy to rotate like this. So in the rigid body, we're going to remove this freeze rotation on Z. And we're going to test how this is going to work. And the other thing that's missing is the sphere collider. So we can select the rolling enemy, click on the cog, actually click on add component, and we can search for sphere collider. Now we click here, and we're going to change its radius to something that is going to be around the entire enemy. So we're going to try 0.75. Okay, you're going to see that it's going to have exactly the proper radius. And notice that the radius that we use is half the size of the sphere. Okay, right now it's 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. Why it's half? Because 1.5 here is the diameter of the sphere. Okay, it's from one side to the opposite side, but the radius is half of the diameter. That's why we use exactly half the value that we added to the scale. If the sphere size was 2 on all the axes, on x, y, and z, then in the rolling enemy sphere collider the radius would be 1. Okay, you see that it perfectly fits the sphere. But as we are using something smaller, we use 0.75 here and 1.5 here. Okay, and now that we have this, let's remove the jumping enemy from here. Let's just leave the rolling enemy. And if we press play, the rolling enemy is simply going to fall. Okay, it's going to be here standing in the floor, and if we give it a little push, you see that it rotates in that axis. Okay, and that's exactly what we want. We want the enemy to rotate to the sides like this. Alright, and now that we have this, let's transform the rolling enemy into a prefab. So I'm going to drag the rolling enemy from here and drop in the prefabs folder. Okay, let's by the way bring it down a little bit, so I'm going to position it here. Let's also press apply, so this position is going to be saved, and in the next video let's work on making the rolling enemy move. So, the thing about the rolling enemy is that it's going to start in one side where the camera can actually see the enemy,